Welcome to the Starting Point Project's live stream broadcast for September 2018. We've been off for a while. Actually, I haven't taken time off. We just haven't done any broadcasts for the summer. Been doing plenty of other things, including 2 Grand Canyon tours. First one, my son went with me again. That was his 4th time. It's awesome having with me. My wife's gone twice. My daughter's gone once. She's kind of been there, done that. And then this time, the second one we did about a month ago or less, my sister and brother-in-law went, and that was a lot of fun. We stayed a little longer, did a few extra things this time, including being on top of Horseshoe Bend. When we do our normal tours, we spend one day walking along the rim, looking down at the river, and then the second day we're actually on the river, which includes being on the raft going around Horseshoe Bend. We always point up to the top where people are watching, and I usually tell people on the raft, I will never be up there because I'm afraid of heights. Well, this time, took our chances. So my sister and brother and I went to the edge there, actually looked down. It's about almost 1,100 feet or so above the river. Got a great panoramic shot there. We also went to an extra canyon that I had not been to before, and that was Antelope Canyon that's nearby. That was a lot of fun, beautiful. Here's just one picture out of many that we took. That's the sunlight coming through, opening there in the cave in canyon there. It's just beautiful. So if anyone's interested, if you haven't gone yet, we're doing it again next year, May 30th through June 2nd. If you want to stay longer, do some of these extra things, that'd be awesome. But that's when our next trip is. When we play our commercial at the end of my talk, you'll see some of the details there, or just contact us through our website. Our next broadcast, you want to put it on your calendar, is Tuesday, October 16th. Make sure you reserve that time. We're covering a lot of great information, and let your friends know. Again, we want to continue to grow our audience. If you're somewhat new to our broadcast, just off the right of the video that you're watching right now, there are some fields. You can actually submit a question live. You can type in the question, then there's a field for your name, maybe first name, last initial, and where you're from, city and state maybe, or country if you're out of the US. And then there's an email field. It's not required for email, but some people have submitted questions, and we didn't have time to cover them during the show, and we had no way of getting back to these people because we don't have your contact information. So if you'd like us to be able to get back to you in case we don't answer the question during the show, send us your email address so we can contact you that way. Also, you can scroll down on the website there and see the broadcast archive button. That'll take you to the screen that shows you all of our previous broadcasts. We've done, 12, 14 or so far, so you can watch all the past ones that way. Our previous series that we completed before we took our summer break was Major Issues with Evolution. It was 4 parts, 4 months in a row. These were some of the topics that we covered. We talked about information, its origin, where does information come from, and then how did it supposedly increase over millions and millions and millions of years of evolution? Where does that new information come from? Then we talked about natural selection and something called the Cambrian explosion of very complex life forms in the fossil record. We talked about irreducible complexity and excluded middle complexity. That's the one that I made up. But we showed about why that's a challenge to the concept of evolution. And then the origin of pink and blue. That's male and female. How do you go from a single-celled organism copying itself over and over and over to having a pink and a blue one, a male and a female, where each has half the required genetic information, and then you have a delivery mechanism where you get the two together to produce offspring? It's a massive problem for the idea of evolution. So that's what we covered in our last series. We are starting a new series this month. It's a 3-part series entitled Icons of Evolution. An icon representing, an event or a concept. We're going to cover this in 3 months, September, October, and November. And an icon, you're familiar with what they are, the cross. When you see a cross, you typically think of the idea of Christianity. When you see scales like that, you might think of the justice system. When you see the Statue of Liberty, you might think of liberty or open border to our country, too open probably today. But coming to the United States, these are icons that get you to think about something else. Well, we're going to look at icons of evolution in this series. Quick humor break here. This has almost nothing to do with what we're covering this evening, but I saw it not too long ago and thought it was funny. This cartoon you're going to see has to do with the real reason evolution started. So keep that in mind. Why did evolution get started? Here's what they say. This cartoon's got one creature saying to the other one, "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you." Now, before you send in any nasty emails to me, I'm not implying anything here. There's no way of knowing which is the male and which is the female. We're not making that point at all. I just saw this and thought it was just kind of funny. So I've seen some other cartoons. We might include those in future broadcasts. So this is what we're going to cover in part one, which is tonight. We're going to cover 4 different icons. First of all, Darwin's tree of life. I've seen the little trees that go up and branch off into different life forms. We'll discuss that. We'll look at the Miller-Urey experiment that has to do with the origin of life. Then we'll look at the peppered moth example, the different colored moths. I'll explain that more when we get to it. And then we'll discuss fossil horses, the little line they have from a small Eohippus going all the way up to the modern horse, supposedly evidences of evolution. Next month, October, part 2, we're going to look at 4 more examples. Ernst Haeckel's embryos, again, supposed evidence of evolution. Archaeopteryx, this creature that was a reptile evolving into a bird. Then we have got homology in vertebrate limbs, similarities in these limbs. We'll discuss that. And then Darwin's finches. You've probably all seen pictures of the finches and the beaks and how that supposedly was evidence that Darwin discovered for evolution. Part 3 in November, 4 more, ape to human transition. That's probably the biggest icon in evolution, the little progression from an ape-like creature all the way up to modern humans. Bacterial resistant to antibiotics. Bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. I say that's evidence for evolution. Then we have whale evolution. You'll see different fossils and bones that they say this is proof of how whales evolved. And then we have vestigial organs, leftover things in our bodies that are useless. They're left over from previous stages of evolution. We'll discuss that also in the 3rd part of the series. So tonight, part 1. Again, these are the 4 we'll do: Darwin's tree of life, the Miller-Urey experiment, peppered moths, and fossil horses. So let's jump in with number 1, which is Darwin's tree of life. Many depictions of this. Here's just one depiction, a little more animated. The whole concept is that somewhere at the bottom of the tree, it's simpler forms of life, and then it goes and it diverges into every other thing, into plants, into crickets, into antelopes, into bunnies, into people, whatever. All the different forms of life have branched out from some single form that came, maybe 3.8 billion years ago. Here's another depiction, a little less graphics with this one. You don't have to worry about reading anything. But again, the idea is you start out with some simpler form of life at the bottom, and then it goes up, reproduces itself, and branches off into every other form of life. This is iconic. It's in the textbooks. When people see that, they think, oh yeah, well, this is, evidence of evolution. They figured out all these details. How do you argue with something like that? Well, it's just a drawing, and we'll take a look at this a little bit further. It really stems back to The Origin of Species, written by Darwin in 1859. In his entire book, there was only one drawing that he included, and it was this. On the top, in the rectangle there, he wrote, "I think." So he's trying to think through how life may have developed over time. Now, initially, he was trained as a theologian. Things changed in his life. He became a little bit bitter towards God, wanted to be able to explain things apart from God. So he was trying to figure out, how do we get the variety of life that we have around us today? So he drew a little sketch here, starting out with number 1 at the bottom, goes up, hits one point, and then it branches off into 2 major branches, diversifies from there. So he's just sketching this out. And it kind of makes sense. If God didn't create things, we'll discuss that a little bit more in a second. If it happened naturally, then I guess it would kind of branch out somehow. So he was just sketching that, and it's been developed further since then. So we have this tree, and here are some of the problems with the trees that they discuss today. Geneticists often manually intervene when doing their sequencing. What does that mean? When you have 2 creatures that they think maybe are related or somewhat similar, they'll look at the genetic code, look at the genes there and compare them, sequence the genes and see how they line up. Well, they will often manually intervene in this process to get them to line up differently or whatever. There are different methods here. So when you do that, obviously it's going to skew to give you the results that you want because you're manually intervening here. Secondly, there are many different alignment methods that can be used giving different results. So again, you use one method, it doesn't really give you what you want. You go to the second one, doesn't give you what you want. The third one, a little closer but not great. The fourth one, yeah, this is much better. This must be the correct one because it's giving me what I expected. Again, there's obviously going to be bias creeping in there. And rather than just having raw data supporting your belief, you're kind of picking and choosing. Thirdly, genetic sequencing often contradicts results obtained from morphology. What does that mean? Well, morphology has to do with more of the physical characteristics of creatures. When you look at two creatures like a crocodile and an alligator, they look a lot more like each other than a crocodile and a chicken. So you could take all the animals on the planet today and lump them into groups and build some kind of tree based on what they look like. Well, when you do that, you come up with a certain tree. But now when you look at them genetically, you get a different tree. It's kind of contradicting what you expected through the morphology. So which is correct? Which do you go with? Well, you go with whichever one supports the idea that you want to be true. So again, this is another issue with the tree that they're looking at. Another problem has to do with the idea of orphan genes. When the DNA gets translated into proteins that carry out all the functions in our body, the DNA is unraveled, and then there's segments that get read and then transcribed into proteins, and they're called these open reading frames, ORFs, and then they made the word orphan out of it. Today, a human orphan is someone whose parents aren't around anymore or didn't want them or whatever, they're not in the picture. Orphan genes are genes that don't seem to have parents. What's the detail behind that? Well, if creature A evolved into creature B, when you're looking at the genes in creature B, you should be able to go back to A and say, oh yeah, this is where they came from. It evolved from A, and so A has those genes and passed it on to B. Sometimes there might be a slight change if there was a mutation going on, but you can see where they came from. Well, often they're finding genes that kind of come out of nowhere. They don't exist in the creature that they think it evolved from. They're orphan genes. So this is a massive problem for the idea of evolution. It's a whole other topic, but it does tie in with kind of messing up the tree that they've been presenting to us for a long time. Here's an article from Nature online here, Nature magazine. The title was "The Band of Biologists Who Redrew the Tree of Life." It's up here. I put this verbiage here in the middle. This changes everything. I've been wanting to do something for a long time. I keep talking about it and never get around to it, but I've kind of wanted to document every time I see in the scientific literature something that says, this changes everything. It's very sensational. It gets your attention, gets you to want to read the article. Well, so often they say they've discovered something that changes everything and rewrites history, rewrites what they thought was true. Well, what they're basically saying is, boy, were we wrong about that, but now we know it's this. Well, if you were wrong before, how do we know for sure you're right now? Because before you told us you were sure, because whatever you believed prior to that, you knew was wrong, and so you changed to the second one, and now the second to the third, and then the third to the fourth. And I know that's how science works, but too often in the textbooks and the articles, they're so confident that now we know for sure because we've got multiple lines of evidence. Well, at many points in history, they have multiple lines of evidence that give us so much confidence we know this is right, and then something else comes along later, this changes everything. So in this book called The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. A radical new history of life. If it's radically new, that means it's a big time change, which means what they were teaching is wrong. And so this tree of life, they're realizing it really isn't representative at all of what apparently happened. Here's a quote. Charles Darwin called it the great tree of life, but as Coyne reveals, at the molecular level, life's history is more accurately depicted as a network, a tangled web through which organisms have been exchanging genes for more than 3 billion years. Now, you probably know I don't necessarily buy into the concept of these billions of years, but they believe that life started almost 3.8 billion years ago. And for most of that time, it's been actually exchanging genes back and forth and sideways. So This tree of life that's been in so many textbooks, starting out with a trunk at the bottom and then diversifying into all the major groups that we have today, they've had to redraw. Now they say it looks more like this, radically different. Yes, you still have things coming up from the bottom, but the big difference is they've got all these horizontal lines going back and forth, meaning that these different lines of descent here are exchanging genes back and forth. Now, there's a lot of artistic license going on here. They don't really know for sure that two very, very disparately different creatures are actually changing genes that way, but they're seeing that genetics are not lining up with what they expected, so they envision now maybe there's all this horizontal gene exchange going back and forth. In reality, I think the tree of life is a lot more like this, not a tree of life, but an orchard of life. Genesis 1 says 10 times that God created creatures to reproduce after their kind. So we got this orchard here of multiple trees that God created, and as they grow, yeah, they can diversify within limits. So they reproduce after their kind, they can produce a variety, but always within limits. And we also have them depicted a little bit shorter here, not representing hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, but a shorter time frame. So if we zoom in and just look at one of these trees, for example, that might represent large cats. And so today we've got lions and tigers and leopards and bobcats. These are all large cats. So we have a variety of large cats today, but they're all cats. We don't see them producing cucumbers or anything else like that. So yes, they can reproduce after their kind and produce a nice variety, but again, always within limits. So you have multiple created lines going up and then varying within the limits. That's what the Bible would predict, and that's actually what we see genetically speaking. So this whole concept of Darwin's tree that was kind of simple going up and diversifying, that's been in textbooks for years and years and years, really doesn't line up with reality. It doesn't line up with homology very well in morphology, and it certainly doesn't line up with genetics. But what we see in genetics is actually backing up what Scripture said all along. So this first icon of evolution, this Darwin's tree of life, really has no real science behind it. Second example, the Miller-Urey Experiment. This has to do with the origin of life. Evolutionists envision dead chemicals coming together fortuitously, just the right way, about 3.8 billion years ago and forming a living cell. Darwin never really addressed the origin of life very much, not very directly anyway, but this experiment talks about that. And so we go back to Darwin, and this is what Darwin said in some of the subsequent editions of The Origin of Species, not the first one, but in subsequent editions, this is what was added. He said, life, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. What was he saying? He was saying, well, maybe God got life started, breathing it into one form of life or a few forms of life, and then it went from there through evolution kind of naturally on its own. But later Darwin said this in a personal letter to somebody. He said, I have long regretted that I truckled to public opinion and used Pentateuchal term of creation. What does that mean? The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So what's he saying is he feels bad that he felt pressure from people to use biblical terms and talk about some kind of a creation event, when he actually says, by which I really meant, appeared by some wholly unknown process. So he was getting pressure from people saying, wait a minute, you're trying to rule out God altogether. You can't do that. So he said, well, God got it started. And later he felt bad he even did that because he didn't believe that himself. He believed that was just a natural process. Nature just did this on its own. And he went on to say, but if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. So he envisioned in some little warm pond all these right chemicals coming together just the right way to undergo even more changes and eventually become alive, and then it could evolve from there. So that was his imagination about how life perhaps got started. So that brings us to the Miller-Urey Experiment back in 1953. Stanley Miller was the graduate student. Harold Urey was the PhD advisor, hence the Miller-Urey Experiment. So this is what they had. They had a contraption that looked like this, and we'll talk about just a few of the details here. They put some gases in here. They were trying to simulate the primeval atmosphere on the Earth, supposedly billions of years ago. They didn't have direct evidence of this at all, but they kind of put in there what they thought they wanted. They were trying to create amino acids in this laboratory, in this environment. Why? Amino acids aren't life. They're not even close to life, but they're building blocks. You got to start somewhere. If you get the right kind of amino acids together the right way, you might get a protein. Proteins aren't even close to life, but if you get the right proteins in the right way, you might be able to build a cell. You got to start somewhere. So they thought if we could show that amino acids could form in this atmosphere, that would show how life got started almost 4 billion years ago. So they put methane, ammonia, hydrogen in there, a little bit of water vapor to simulate again the supposed Earth's primeval atmosphere. Then they introduced a spark into the chamber to simulate lightning on a primeval Earth. You got to energize this thing to get it going. Then they introduced a trap to simulate a trap. What's that? Well, why did they put a trap in here? Because if they formed anything in this experiment, if they left it in that environment, whatever they formed would be destroyed hundreds or thousands of times faster than they accumulate. This is a terrible atmosphere to be in. So they had to have a trap at the bottom to trap those things out, to not let them stay in that atmosphere. Well, again, that's not very realistic, but they needed to do that in the experiment. There's also a gas in here they did not include, and that's oxygen. Now, oxygen's pretty important for life. Why didn't they put it in there? Well, he knew if oxygen existed in here, the oxygen itself would destroy things and you won't get the amino acids you want. But someone else said, well, wait a minute. If the Earth's ancient atmosphere did not have any oxygen, there would be no ozone layer around the Earth, which is O3. If you don't have an ozone layer, the sun's ultraviolet light rays come through to destroy things. So if you have oxygen, you're in trouble. If you don't have oxygen, you're in trouble. Well, they're in a laboratory. They don't have to worry about the sunlight coming through. So they just said, well, we think the Earth's ancient atmosphere had little or no oxygen at all, so they left it out. Well, here's some other issues. The results that they got. 2% of what they created were the amino acids they were looking for. Now, they didn't get all of them that they needed, but they did get some amino acids, 2%. Just about claimed they had created life in a laboratory. There are more problems with that. 85% of what they produced was a toxic tar, harmful to life, containing cyanide and formaldehyde. And then the remaining 13% was carboxylic acids, also harmful, toxic to life. Again, not a good atmosphere to be in if you're trying to build these blocks to make proteins and the proteins to make a cell. But there are further problems with this as well. Problem referred to as chirality or handedness, left-handed, right-handed. Why is that an issue? Well, life only consists of left-handed amino acids. This experiment produced half left-handed, half right-handed. That's a big problem. Let's do a simple analogy so you kind of see where we're headed with this. Let's say you have a massively huge bag filled with billions and billions and billions of red and blue blocks. The red ones are your left-handed amino acids. The blue ones are your right-handed amino acids. Half of each, 50-50 mixture here. You have to reach into this bag blindfold and pull out just red blocks to make a chain with the left-handed amino acids. So let's take a look at that. So every time you reach in to pull out a block, 50-50 chance of getting a red one. So you reach in the first time and you pull out a red block, great, you put it on the table. Reach in a second time, 50-50 chance, you get a second red one. You got 2 in a row, you're building a chain of amino acids to maybe eventually make a protein, to maybe eventually make a cell. Reach in a third time, another red one. Well, you're getting a little lucky, not a big shock, but you're having a good day. Fourth time, another red one. Well, you are starting to get a little bit more lucky. A fifth time, another red block. Wow. You have 1 chance in 32 of getting 5 in a row. So if there are 32 people, each having a bag of billions of blocks, reaching in, one person out of the 32 might get 5 in a row. Again, it's not that big of a shock. You reach it a 6th time, oh, you got a blue block. You don't put the blue one back and start over. That blue one just destroyed your chain of 5. Put them all back and start over from scratch. You think you're ever going to get 10 in a row? Probably not. How about 25 red ones in a row? To get 25 red blocks in a row, that's less than one chance in over 33.5 million. That is not a good chance, and that's just 25. You'd have to have about 300 red blocks in a row just to get a simple protein, and a protein isn't even life, not even close to life. It is not going to work this way at all. What are the chances? Just somehow this happened. Because that's what they'll say. Well, you know, we had enough time and just somehow it came together. Well, let's take a look at that with probability. The number I'm going to give you comes from Sir Frederick Hoyle. He was one of the world's leading astronomers and mathematicians. He was an atheist for most of his life. He came to the conclusion there must be a God just by studying math and science. But before I give you the number he calculated, I have to ask you a question. What is your cutoff? Meaning, if the chances are less than 1 in some number, you're going to say that can't happen that just can't be an accident. Well, what is your number? Less than 1 chance in some number. Let's say you throw out some really big number. Let's say you say, I don't know, 10 million billion. That's a really big number. So you're going to say if the chances are less than 1 in 10 million billion, you would conclude, okay, that it's not an accident. There had to be some design there. All right, well, what was Sir Frederick Hoyle's number? He said the chances that life could have formed in all the time that they say we've had and chemicals banging together, whatever, is 1 chance in a 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. That's 10 raised to the 40,000th power. That's a 1 with 40,000 zeros after that. Is his number bigger than 10 million billion? Yeah, just a little bit. It's 10 million billion times 10 million billion times 10 million billion times 10 million billion, 2,500 times. You have to multiply that number times itself. That is a phenomenally big number. So any rational person is going to say, you know what, that just can't happen by accident. If you want to believe that life formed that way, that's fine, but your faith is much stronger than mine, because to me it's just extremely unreasonable to believe that. To me, that screams this was not an accident at all. One other quick analogy, a Rubik's Cube. Most people have played with a Rubik's Cube, so it's a little bit more tangible. A Rubik's Cube has a lot of different combinations to it. In fact, it has 10 million trillion combinations, and only one is right. So if you're blindfolded and you're spinning away randomly, you'd have 1 chance in 10 million billion of getting 10 million trillion of getting this thing right. Again, most rational people would admit, okay, yeah, I'm not going to solve it by accident. Let's compare solving this cube by accident to the big number from Sir Frederick Hoyle. It'd be like me handing you the cube, putting the blindfold on, you start spinning away randomly, and you solve this cube 2,105 times in a row, getting it right every single time. Is that ever going to happen? No, not even close. But yet that's what we teach in the school systems. That 3.8 billion years ago, dead chemicals came together just right to form that living cell. That's a wonderful story, just doesn't have any real science behind it. So this icon of this Miller-Urey experiment, it doesn't show how life formed billions of years ago. It's fraught with problems. It does not give credence to that at all, but it's just one of those icons. When people see it, they say, well, you know, there must be evidence they showed how life formed a long time ago, because they got the picture here. Third example, the peppered moth. Some of you know exactly what this is. Others have never even heard of this, so I will step through this one. This is called the quintessential example of Darwinism in action. This is one of the best evidences for evolution. And here's how the story goes. We have 2 moths here on this tree. The one in the rectangle there is harder to see. It's camouflage. It's lighter color. It blends in with the fungal growth on the tree, the lichens. The darker one sticks out like a sore thumb. So the birds are flying over. They're swooping down. They're picking off the dark-colored moths left and right. After a while, we don't have very many dark-colored moths left because most of them are being eaten. But we have a lot of light-colored moths because they blend in. Then the Industrial Revolution kicks in. Pollution goes up into the atmosphere. The trees become dark color. Now the dark ones blend in very well, but the light ones stick out like a sore thumb. Birds are flying over, they're still hungry, they're swooping down there, picking off the light-colored moths left and right. So now we have very few light-colored moths, but a lot of dark ones. There's proof of evolution. Now, if you don't quite get that, you're in good company, because when I first heard that, I didn't get it either. I thought, wait a minute, initially we had light and dark-colored moths. Afterwards, we had light and dark-colored moths. And it's not like you even had a light-colored moth that evolved into a dark-colored moth, and even if you did, it's still just a moth. But the most interesting thing about this is it never really happened this way. Scientists took some dead moths, glued them to the trees, took pictures, put it in the textbooks, and told the story. We found out later that this really wasn't realistic at all. Most of these moths perch in leaves high up in the trees. They don't just sit on the trunks out in the open there. And so we know that the way this was depicted originally is really more fraudulent and really not accurate as to how it actually happened. Here's an interesting quote from Dr. Jerry Coyne. He's one of the leading evolutionists. He said, "From time to time, evolutionists re-examine a classic experimental study and find, to their horror, that it is flawed or downright wrong. My own reaction resembles the dismay attending my discovery at the age of 6 that it was my father and not Santa who brought the presents on Christmas Eve." So he was just shocked to find out this whole peppered moth thing really wasn't what it was drawn up to be when he found out the details. But what's interesting is that he has done a flip-flop. You like that? It's kind of creative, a flip-flop. You get it? He's changed his mind, and now he says this: despite arguments about the precise mechanism of selection, this, meaning the peppered moth story, still represents a splendid example of evolution in action. It actually doesn't at all. It doesn't show how one creature slowly changes into something and gets more and more complex and you get new information and all that. What it is possibly a good example of is natural selection. Since they did the original experiments, they've done some others, and they found out that yes, occasionally moths can land there, apparently earlier in the morning, and it's obvious that the ones that stick out more are going to be eaten more frequently than the ones that blend in. So we've seen that happen a few times. Mostly they're not there, but it can happen. But even when it does, it has nothing to do with one creature evolving into another one. It's a prime example of natural selection, which is survival of the fittest, which does explain the survival of the fittest. The ones that blend in better to their environment, they're going to survive better. They're not seen as much. They're not eaten as much. They will survive to procreate. The ones that stick out like a sore thumb, they'll be eaten more and might go by the wayside. That's natural selection. It's a fact of nature, but it's not a force of nature. Natural selection isn't a powerful thing that does things. It's just a description of what we observe in nature, that those creatures that are fit survive, those that aren't don't. Natural selection does not explain the arrival of the fittest, just the survival. It doesn't explain how new things come into being. It can't create anything new. So yes, it might be an example of why certain things survive, but it's not an example of evolution, how things get more and more complex over time. Here's an oversimplified example. We have two types of skateboards up here. You got red ones and blue ones. Let's say over time we notice that some of them start disappearing, but the red ones are disappearing a lot more frequently than the blue ones. If that type of a process continues on into the future, will that eventually produce a bright yellow Camaro? No, not at all. You're not going to produce a new engine and all these electronic parts and all that by getting rid of things. It's the same thing with the peppered moth. Even though one might be eaten or the other one, that's not going to change them into a toad or a human being or anything else. So that's just kind of a simple way of looking at it. That's natural selection. It's really not upward evolution at all. So the peppered moth just doesn't fly. Yeah, bad joke, but you guys aren't paying for these shows. I save the good jokes for the paying customers, and since we don't charge anything, I guess I never give any good jokes. So we're going to move on very quickly to the last one for tonight's show, and that is fossil horses. You've probably seen these depictions here of a smaller horse evolving up into the larger one, the Eohippus up to the modern horse. It's in a lot of textbooks. This first one, Eohippus, was actually discovered by Sir Richard Owen. If the name sounds familiar, this is a guy, a brilliant scientist. He was actually a creationist. He's the one who gave us the word dinosaur in 1841. when he discovered that fossil, he didn't think it had anything to do with horses. The way they draw it up today, they make it look like an ancient horse. It really wasn't, but he didn't see any evidence for that at all, but they've hijacked it and put it into this line here of how horses have evolved. And then, of course, we've got it in the museum. And picture the millions of students going through the museums and adults, filing past these displays, seeing the pictures there with the plaques, seeing the stories told there, and then looking up and seeing the actual skeletons, the actual bones. I mean, that's a fact. They've got the bones there, they're showing you the pictures, and they're telling you how evolution occurred. What more could you possibly ask for? In fact, a lot of these students, they don't even read a whole lot of it. They just see pictures of horses, they see actual bones. That's proof. I mean, that's evolution versus creation. That's just a Bible thing, which is just a religious story, and the Bible is just antiquated and outdated, and it's filled with errors and contradiction, and it's a story, it's myth, where evolution is science. That's the impression they get. Again, they don't even have to read any of it. They just file by it, they see it, and it was in their textbook. It's kind of cool now. They get to see it in person, what they saw in their textbook. And this happens over and over and over. But there's a lot of interesting things about this, including this quote from Dr. Niles Eldredge. He's one of the leading evolutionists. Key point here, former curator at the American Museum of Natural History. The American Museum, keep that in mind for a second. Here's what he said. I admit that an awful lot has gotten into the textbooks as though it were true. For instance, the most famous example still on exhibit in the American Museum, that's his museum, is the exhibit on horse evolution. That has been presented as literal truth in textbook after textbook. Now I think that is lamentable. By the time it filters down to the textbooks, we've got a problem. So what's he saying? He's saying, yeah, we know it's not true and it never really happened that way and it probably shouldn't be in the textbooks. Well, if it didn't happen and it shouldn't be in the textbooks, then why is it okay to have it in the museums? It's really not. And it's giving a false impression to, again, millions of people who are filing through there year after year after year. Well, we've got all these pictures of these horses, and again, just the visual seems to imply they've got these evidences. And here's an article from Wikipedia, which is what, the 67th book of the Bible, right? This is what they said. The evolution of the horse occurred over a geologic timescale of 50 million years, transforming the small dog-sized forest-dwelling Eohippus into modern horse. Paleozoologists have been able to piece together a more complete outline of the evolutionary lineage of modern horses than of any other animal. So this is just rock solid. They got more evidence for the evolution of horses than anything else out there, and then you got the pictures there, so it seems straightforward. Now, I noticed on their website below the picture, they had a small caption saying, okay, it's not necessarily straightforward like we're showing here. So they did have that caveat, but most people aren't going to see that. But unfortunately, you see these pictures. Here's a similar picture from Encyclopedia Britannica, and they give you the impression that it is straightforward because, I mean, look at this. It couldn't be any more straight going up and down. They got the pictures of the horses, and they got their names on this tree. There are branches that go off, but the main ones that they're showing are just in the trunk of the tree going up. So then they do give you the impression this is just really straightforward, even though the fossils don't support that for a number of reasons. And it's similar to doing this. We have creatures that are alive today, that they didn't evolve from each other, but you could line them up and tell a story of how one evolved into the other one. You could look at their bones and make a display out of it. But again, we know that one did not evolve from the other. And here with modern horses today, ones that are all alive today, they're all horses. They range greatly in height from 4 to 20 hands. I think a hand is about 4 inches. So they go from about 16 inches tall, it's pretty short, to 6.5 feet tall. That's a huge variety of horses today. Imagine finding fossils of these things, their bones buried. You dig them up, it's like, wow, this one, the small one, must be ancient, and it evolved over millions of years into the big one. No, they're both modern horses. They're living at the same time. And then we've got this. Their ribs vary, 17, 18, 19 ribs. If you found those buried today, you'd say, oh, well, the 17 ribs, that was here first, and then evolved into the 18 and then 19. No, they're just varieties of horses that exist today. And then their toes. Some horses today actually have 3 toes versus the 1 hoof here. So you can't just line them up. It goes from 4 hooves down, 4 toes to 3, and then down to the 1 that we have today. So again, there's just a lot of storytelling that's going on today. So when we look at the series of the horses, it's a powerful visual for people. They see that, say, well, they got proof because look at the pictures here. But when you look at the details and you see the rest of the story, it just really doesn't cut it. So those are the four we covered in tonight's program: Darwin's Tree of Life, the Miller-Urey Experiment, peppered moths, and fossil horses. Next month, in October, we're going to look at Ernst Haeckel's embryos, Archaeopteryx, homology and vertebrate limbs, and Darwin's finches. And that date is going to be October 16th. So again, put it on your calendar. That's when we'll cover that. What we're going to do next here after a very, very, very short break is we're going to do our Q&A. So it's about a minute break. So hang in there. We'll see you in just about a minute. We are back. We are off for the summer, 3 months, not doing these broadcasts, and we decided we're going to do something a little different tonight and switch it up. We have audience members that come. In fact, if you're watching live, if you happen to live somewhere in southeastern Wisconsin area, we'd love to have you for one of the live shows. You just have to contact us ahead of time so we can schedule, because we have a limited seating here. Contact us through the website, and we can get you scheduled in for one of the shows. We love having people here, and tonight we've had some of our audience members submit some questions. They've given them to my producer, so he's going to read them to me, and we will start with the first one.
Okay, from Robert. I am enjoying your book, Creation and Evolution. Is it a revision of Let There Be Light, or is it a different book?
All right, from Robert. We don't know where Robert's from, but he's from somewhere. He had a question about my book. The book Creation, if I had it in my hand, that'd be impressive right now and useful. The book is called Creation and Evolution, Compatible or in Conflict. He's wondering, is that a revision of Let There Be Light, or is it something totally new? It's basically a revision. When I first wrote the book, we called it Let There Be Light. Since then, it's been taken on by Master Books, which is the largest creation book publisher in the world, so it was an honor for me to have them publish the book. And they wanted it to change the name and the graphic on the cover, which was fine by me. So the two books, Let There Be Light and Creation and Evolution, are pretty much the same book. I made a few changes, but nothing real major. So if you got one, you pretty much have the content for the second one. I am writing 2 other books. I'm about a third of the way through. The second one, which will be called Faith, is not a 4-letter word. That sounds familiar. It's because we have a DVD by that title. Writing a book along the same lines, I'll be able to expand on that particular topic. The third book is going to be called Creation to Christ, the Old Testament in a Nutshell. If that sounds familiar, we have a DVD on that as well. So that book will follow that, but then be able to expand on it as well. So working on those, it'll probably take a while before they're published, but we've got those in the hopper right now. So next question.
Okay, from Tom in the studio. I've been hearing on the news they are detecting radio waves from space. How do you explain that?
All right, from Tom in the studio here. He's been hearing in the news that they've been detecting these radio waves from space. I'm not sure the specific stories that he's hearing yet, but here's the general backdrop to that. Secular scientists are interested in the concept of life in outer space for a couple different reasons. Some secular scientists believe that if life evolved here on this planet, probably evolved somewhere else. Now, I personally don't believe that it did evolve here. I don't believe it could possibly have evolved here for many scientific reasons. But the logic holds. If it truly could have here, then why not somewhere else? It's a big universe. So they believe there's probably life out there, so they're searching for evidence for that. Other scientists have been convinced there's no way life could have evolved here with the conditions on this planet. But because they don't really want to go with the creation narrative, they believe that it must have evolved somewhere else first and then came here later. So they also are looking for signs of intelligent life in outer space. Again, how are they going to know if there's intelligent life out there? Well, short of some alien coming all the way to Earth and saying, hey, here I am, they're looking for signals from outer space. If we go back to the time of Carl Sagan, he was one of the world's leading atheists. He had the original TV series, The Cosmos. He was very involved with our government, with radio telescopes, trying to detect signals coming from outer space to see if any of them may be coming from intelligent life. Somebody asked, how are you going to know if these signals are actually coming from intelligent life? He said, well, it's pretty easy. If there's any pattern or any complexity to them, we'll know that had to have come from intelligent life because that wouldn't happen by accident. Well, what's interesting is he could consider his own DNA, which is millions and millions of times more complex than a dot, dot, dash, and he would say his DNA, oh, that just happens by accident. So there's an example of a very intelligent scientist not really making any sense, not being consistent with his own logic. So they've got these radio telescopes pointed in outer space, listening for signals, trying to decide if any of them are coming from intelligent sources. Again, they're looking for patterns or complexity. Then they would conclude that must have come from intelligent life because that wouldn't happen by accident. But they will deny all the complexities of living things we see here and say, well, those things can happen by accident. So it sounds like very recently they found specific signals and they're implying that maybe that's evidence of life out there. And sometimes what happens is NASA will be expending a lot of money looking for evidence of life in outer space. Nothing's really coming of it. So then sometimes the funding gets pulled back and then magically all of a sudden they think they discovered something that's almost proof that there's life out there. So the money starts coming back in from the government, which is our tax money. And then that doesn't really go anywhere. So then it kind of falls off, but then they discover something else to kind of keep the funding going. So I'll have to see what these specific reports are, but that's the general backdrop to that question.
Okay, from Jack in Illinois, who is not in the studio, do you have material that address the 4 criteria you use to validate the Bible as God's Word?
Okay, Jack in Illinois, who's again not in our studio, sent in the question, do I have sources that cover the 4 major categories of evidence for the inspiration of Scripture? We do. And here's the point, a lot of people say, well, the Bible is just, an antiquated book, just a bunch of guys made it up a long time ago. There's so much evidence that there's no way that that's possible. All the evidence points to that these men were inspired by God supernaturally in what they wrote. And in some of my resources, we cover 4 major categories: internal consistency, historical accuracy, prophetic accuracy, and scientific accuracy. Internal consistency. Does the source contradict itself? Well, the Bible is written by about 40 human authors over a 1,600-year period on 3 different continents and 3 different languages and covers hundreds of controversial topics, and yet all the authors agree with each other. It's internally consistent. That's only possible if they're inspired by God. If they were making this stuff up, they would be contradicting each other right and left. Historical accuracy, they get history right. Prophetic accuracy, 27% of the Bible is prophetic in nature, making predictions about the future. I think about half have already come true in every minute detail. The other half is for the future yet. And then scientific accuracy, a lot of things in Scripture that were written a long time ago, we're finding out today are scientifically accurate. And it's making people wonder, like, how in the world would they have known those things? They wouldn't have known them on their own. They had to have been inspired by God. So we do cover those things in a number of resources. The book I mentioned before, Creation and Evolution, there's an entire chapter in there on the inspiration of Scripture. We have a separate DVD, Is the Bible the Inspired Word of God? We cover those 4 categories there. And then we also have a small pocket-sized booklet available on our website, How Do We Know the Bible is the Inspired Word of God? So those are the 3 main sources. We are also in the process of recording now a new 5-session DVD series on that whole topic of the inspiration of Scripture. We've got 2 of them recorded. We got to record 3 more and then produce them and get the DVDs out. That'll happen a little bit later this year, but great resources coming out soon.
Okay, from Hector, why do people just believe Darwin like his tree of life icon? What made him so special?
Great question from Hector in the studio here about why do people just believe Darwin and the picture of the tree of life and all that. It has to do a lot with when you hear something often enough, and repeat it and you hear it widespread enough, it just kind of becomes true because you just hear it everywhere. Everybody believes it. So from kindergarten on up, we see these pictures of the tree of life or the ape-men progression or whatever it is. You see it in the textbooks, you see it on TV and documentaries, on the internet, just over and over and over. So, I mean, it's got to be true or they wouldn't be saying it. That's the mindset. It's kind of indoctrination. That's the only view that you're presenting to them. So they think they've got no reason to doubt it. They never really get to hear the other side of the story. One scientist actually said it's not healthy to share both sides, to let them think critically, because they might doubt the evolution side, and we can't have that. It's like, well, wait a minute, why can't you just tell them evidence that supposedly supports both sides? They can make up their own minds. You're not telling them what to believe, you're just teaching them how to think. But we've lost that art today. So people just somewhat blindly believe what Darwin wrote and what other scientists write today because, hey, it's science. And they have the impression that science is black and white. It is what it is. You can't argue with it. Whereas the Bible, that's religious and can be interpreted different ways and can have various meanings. And it's not actually as important, doesn't relate to the real world that we live in. So unfortunately, that's why many people actually just buy into these things because they just see it all around them. And most of them have never heard the other side. That's one of the main reasons we do this broadcast, is to try to get the other side out, because the vast majority of what I'm sharing here will never see the light of day in a public school system or a state university. Great question, though.
Okay, another question that just popped up a couple seconds ago. Somebody submitted it, named Dan, don't know where he's from. Is there an intentional effort to hide the flaws in the icons you've been talking about? It seems it could or should create serious doubt in what we are being told and undermine the scientific process.
Sure. Question that was just submitted live by Dan. Is there an effort to purposely hide or cover up some of these things? I think there are very strong cases that this happened. Now, I want to be careful when I say that. I don't think that belief in evolution is this worldwide conspiracy where all these secular scientists, they all know it's wrong, but they all get together regularly and they say, hey, we know this is wrong, but hey, we're going to lie about it, right? I don't believe that for a second. None of the creationists that I know believe that whatsoever. However, because I believe that this is largely a spiritual issue and not just an academic debate, I believe that a lot of them actually buy into these things and believe it's true. Occasionally, some of them realize these are just out and out frauds or wrong, and cover-ups happen. They'll keep it quiet, and typically what can happen is they find out that a certain line of evidence is just mistakenly wrong or fraudulently wrong, and they don't want to draw too much attention to it because it leaves too big of a hole. So it just kind of hangs around for a long time until some new evidence or some new flashy thing comes up that they can draw attention to, and then they quietly dismiss the other thing and say, okay, yeah, that other one was wrong, but it doesn't matter because we got this one now. So it kind of quietly goes away. I've seen that happen quite a bit, but there's been, a fair amount of effort to do that. The other thing that happens is sometimes when it's found out that something was a mistake or was true fraud, the leading scientists know that, but a lot of times the teachers in the high schools don't know that. So the teachers, they keep teaching it because that's what they learned growing up, and it's in the textbooks that they're using. So I caution people, don't be too harsh with your teachers in the public school system or the state universities, because a lot of them, they don't know there are problems with these things in the textbooks because they've never heard that themselves. They went through the public school system, they heard that was true. Later, they're teaching it themselves. Because where are they going to hear the truth? It's not going to be on the cover of Time magazine or Smithsonian or anything like that. They won't allow anything really to be published that goes against the paradigm of evolution being absolute fact.
Okay, from James in Wisconsin, what resources do you have for and or against the Big Bang?
James in Wisconsin, resources for Big Bang. A very, very interesting topic. I cover that briefly in the book, Creation and Evolution. There's a chapter on the origin of the universe. We also have a booklet titled, What About the Big Bang?, where I cover that and that information. Again, we put that into the book, but it's also in booklet form. And then in one of our DVDs, Creation versus Evolution, the Case from Science, I cover the origin of the universe, origin of life, and origin of species from a high level. And in that DVD, one of the first things we cover is the Big Bang, because that's kind of the most widely accepted concept of the origin of the universe. We are in the process of recording and producing some other DVDs When we do that series, I will have an entire DVD just on the origin of the universe, and I'll go into the Big Bang in a lot more detail, but that'll be a number of months before that one comes out.
Okay, Jay, one last question that's right up your alley, so to speak, from Jerry in Texas. Will my old laptop evolve into a new iPad due to the want force because I really want one?
Jerry in Texas, question about his poor laptop. Will it evolve into an iPad due to the want force because he wants it to? Very funny, but it's kind of sad too because very often we read in the scientific literature this creature evolved something because it needed it or wanted it in a sense. The fish evolved lungs because they needed to forage up onto land to find new sources of food because food is becoming scarce in the ocean. So sometimes the popular literature will give you the impression this creature needed it, so it evolved it. The leading evolutionists don't believe that story for a second, but too often the popular literature will give you that impression that that's how evolution works. So will his laptop turn into an iPad? I don't believe it will ever happen, but if evolution is true, it's going to take millions of years anyway. By that time, he'll be long gone, so I guess it doesn't matter, and we'll never find out. So our next broadcast is October 16th. We hope that you're enjoying these broadcasts, that you learned a lot. We covered 4 icons. We'll do 4 more next month. Put it on your calendar. Tell more people about it. We want to get the word out to as many people. It's a free resource. We love to get this information out without having to charge people. So if you have questions in the meantime, you could submit them anytime because we accumulate them. We can cover them in the next show, or we can cover them directly if you give us your email address. So we appreciate you guys taking your time to be with us this evening. God bless.